He disappeared for months, and when he came back, nobody recognized the way he played. Some swore he'd made a deal with the devil, that he'd walked to a lonely crossroads at midnight and traded his soul for the guitar. He recorded just 29 songs. He died before he turned 28, and to this day, nobody knows for certain where he's buried. There are 3 graves with his name on them. At most, one of them is real. Almost no photographs of him exist. For decades, people who worshipped his music had no idea what his face even looked like. And yet this man, who sold barely any records while he was alive, would go on to shape Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and half the rock and roll you've ever heard. His life lasted 27 years. His legend has lasted almost a century. His name was Robert Johnson. And here's the strange thing about his story. The more researchers dug, the more the facts started to sound as unbelievable as the myths. So this isn't just the story of a blues musician. It's the story of a man whose greatest mystery may never be solved. And by the end, you'll have to decide something for yourself. Was Robert Johnson simply a genius who worked harder than anyone alive? Or did the mystery around him become just as powerful as the music itself? Let's start where the legend didn't. At the beginning, with a boy nobody expected anything from at all. Long before the myth, before the whispers about the devil, Robert Johnson was just another young man in the Mississippi Delta. And even that plain beginning is tangled in uncertainty. We think he was born on the 8th of May, 1911, near Hazelhurst, Mississippi. We're not even sure of that. Different records give different years. His own death certificate got his age wrong. He was the son of an affair, born into a large, poor family. And as a boy, he was passed between households and even between names. At different times, he answered to different surnames entirely. Before he was famous, he was hard to even keep track of. This was the Delta in the early 20th century, flat, endless cotton fields under a punishing sun. Most black families here were sharecroppers, working land they'd never own, chained to debts they could never clear. Childhood meant labor. Backbreaking days bent over cotton rows, for pay that barely counted as pay. Music was the one thing that didn't cost anything. It drifted out of churches on Sunday and out of juke joints on Saturday night, those hot, loud little shacks where people drank and danced and forgot the fields for a few hours. Young Robert was drawn to it early. He started on the harmonica and the jaw harp, the cheap instruments a poor kid could actually get his hands on. He hung around the older musicians who worked the area, legends of the Delta, like Charlie Patton, Willie Brown, and a fierce, preaching bluesman named Sunhouse. Robert watched them the way a kid watches giants. He wanted in. He wanted to be one of them. There was just one problem. When he finally picked up a guitar and tried to play in front of them, people started to laugh. Here's something the legend leaves out. In the beginning, Robert Johnson was not good. Not a little rough. Genuinely, painfully bad. The men who remembered it best were Sunhouse and Willie Brown, 2 of the finest players in the Delta. Years later, Sunhouse told the story again and again to researchers, and it never got kinder. The way House told it, Robert was a decent harmonica player as a kid, passable, but he was desperate to play guitar. So when House and Brown took breaks between sets at the juke joints, Robert would grab one of their guitars and start banging away. And it was rough, so rough that people in the crowd would groan. According to House, they'd tell the boy to put it down before he drove the customers off. Give the guitar back. Stick to the harmonica. You're making noise, not music. Picture that for a second. The man the whole world would one day call the king of the Delta blues, being told, plainly, that he had no talent, that he was embarrassing himself, told to stop. Most people, hearing that from the best musicians they knew, would quit, would take the hint and go back to the cotton. Robert didn't take the hint, but he didn't argue either. He didn't stand there and prove them wrong. And there was a deeper wound the laughing crowd couldn't see. A year or 2 earlier, still just a teenager, Robert had married a young girl named Virginia Travis. By some accounts, she was only 14. He loved her enough to do the unthinkable for a restless musician. He set the guitar down. He took a farming job. He tried to build an ordinary, settled life. Then Virginia got pregnant. She went to stay with her family so they could help with the birth. Robert set off to join her, stopping to play a little music along the way. And by the time he arrived, it was over. Virginia and the baby had both died in childbirth. They were already buried. He was still a teenager, and he'd lost his wife and his child in a single stroke. And here's the detail that would haunt everything after. Virginia's deeply religious family blamed him. They said it was punishment from God for playing the blues, for singing what they called the devil's music. That phrase, "sold your soul to the devil," was thrown at Robert Johnson years before any Crossroads. Not as a legend, as an accusation from grieving in-laws over 2 fresh graves. So when he finally left the Delta, he wasn't only running from the laughter, he was running from grief and from a curse people had already started to speak over him. Instead, one day, he was simply gone. He left Robinsonville. He left the juke joints. He left the men who'd laughed at him. And for a good while, nobody knew where Robert Johnson had gone. This is the gap in the story, the empty stretch of time where history goes quiet and legend rushes in to fill it. Somewhere between 1 and 2 years passed, maybe more. Robert had vanished from the Delta circuit, where everyone knew him as the kid who couldn't play. And when he finally came back, he was a different musician entirely. Not improved, transformed. Sunhouse lived to describe the moment, and the shock never left his voice. Robert turned up again, walked in with a guitar, and asked to play. House and the others probably braced for the same old racket. Then Robert started, and House couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't the boy they'd chased off the stage. This was a master, fingers moving in ways that didn't seem possible, a bass line, and a melody, and a slide part, all happening at once, like there were 2 guitarists in the room instead of 1. The room that used to groan when Robert reached for a guitar fell silent. Then it erupted. The same people who'd told him to sit down and give it back couldn't take their eyes off him. In the space of a year or two, the worst guitarist anyone knew had somehow become the best they'd ever seen. Things like that aren't supposed to happen. And when something impossible happens right in front of people, they reach for impossible explanations. House was stunned, and in one interview decades later, trying to explain the impossible leap, he said the thing that would echo through history. That Robert must have sold his soul to the devil to play like that. He almost certainly meant it as a figure of speech. The way you'd say someone plays like a man possessed. But those words, from a man who was actually there, lit the fuse on the greatest myth in blues history. Because here's what really happened in that missing year. And it's less supernatural, but almost as remarkable. Robert had gone back toward Hazelhurst, the area where he was born. And there he found a mentor, a gifted, little-known guitarist named Ike Zimmerman. Robert moved in with Zimmerman's family and studied under him for months. One of Zimmerman's daughters confirmed it years later. Plainly, Robert asked her father to teach him, so he did. And Robert stayed a long time. There's even a detail here that sounds like myth, but probably isn't. Zimmerman was said to practice at night, in graveyards. Not to summon spirits, though people whispered that too. More likely for the simplest reason imaginable. It was quiet, it was private, and out among the headstones, nobody complained about the noise. So the truth of the transformation wasn't a deal at a crossroads. It was a year of obsessive, relentless practice, in the dark, over the graves, until his hands could do anything. But the truth would never travel as far as the rumor. And the rumor was about to become a story the whole world would tell. This is the story that made Robert Johnson immortal. And almost none of it is true, which somehow makes it more interesting, not less. The legend goes like this. Late one night, Robert took his guitar to a deserted crossroads where 2 empty highways met under a black Delta sky. He waited, and at the stroke of midnight, a huge shadowy figure came walking down the road. The devil himself. The figure took Robert's guitar, tuned it, handed it back, and in that instant, sealed a bargain. Robert would play the blues like no one who ever lived. And in exchange, when the time came, the devil would collect his soul. In some versions, the bargain even came with a clock. The devil would give him only a handful of years to burn bright, and then take what he was owed. And this is the part that makes people shiver. From the time Robert reappeared with his impossible new talent, to the night he died was roughly 8 years. Almost exactly the sentence the legend describes. It's a perfect story. It explains the impossible overnight talent. It explains the dark, haunted feeling in his music. And it explains his early death. Everything ties together too neatly. But dig into it, and it falls apart in fascinating ways. Start with this. Robert Johnson never told that story about himself. There's no record of him claiming any deal. The famous Crossroads boast actually belonged to a different bluesman, Tommy Johnson, no relation, whose own brother told researchers Tommy had sold his soul. Over time, that tale drifted loose and attached itself to Robert, helped along by Son House's offhand devil comment, and by a few of Robert's own song titles that flirted with the dark. And the Crossroads itself is far older than any bluesman. Across West African and European folklore alike, a crossroads was believed to be a threshold, a place where the everyday world and the spirit world crossed. In some traditions, a spirit waited there who could grant a person extraordinary skill, but only if they were brave enough to meet him in the dark. The blues didn't invent that idea. It inherited it. Today, there's a monument in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where highways 61 and 49 meet. Two big blue guitars on a signpost. Tourists pull over, take photos, and imagine the deal happening right there. It's a wonderful place to stand, but no one can say Robert ever stood there at all. So the myth grew bigger than the man. And while people traded these stories in juke joints, and later, in books, the real Robert Johnson did something the legend almost forgets. He walked into a recording studio. Robert Johnson recorded a shockingly small amount of music. That's part of what makes what happened next so hard to explain. In November of 1936, he traveled to San Antonio, Texas. To get there at all, he'd tracked down a record store owner and talent scout who fed new blues singers to the labels and talked his way into a session. His recording studio, when he arrived, was a room in the Gunter Hotel, room 414. There was no grand label, no orchestra, just a producer named Don Law, some basic equipment set up in a hotel room, and a young Delta musician with a guitar. By one well-worn account, Robert was so shy, or so protective of his secrets, that he played turned away from everyone, facing the wall in the corner of the room. Whether that's literally true, or just another piece of the legend, it fits the man. Even in the act of being recorded, he seemed to be holding something back. Over 3 days in San Antonio, he laid down 16 songs, plus alternate takes of most of them. The following summer, he traveled to Dallas and recorded 13 more. And here's a fact that should make you wince. For each song, Robert was simply paid a flat fee in cash. No royalties. Not a cent of the fortune his music would later earn. He recorded the work that would make other men millions, pocketed a little walking around money, and left. 29 songs. That was the whole of it. A couple of dozen recordings made in improvised rooms on primitive gear, and then it was over forever. But listen to what's in those 29 songs. Sweet Home Chicago, which became a blues standard, played in bars all over the world. Come On In My Kitchen, Aching and Gentle, Crossroad Blues. A Man Alone at an Empty Intersection, Begging the Sky for Mercy. And the darkest of them all, Hellhound on My Trail, and Me and the Devil Blues, where a haunted narrator can't outrun whatever's chasing him. In his lifetime, only one of these was any kind of hit. A song called Terraplane Blues, which sold modestly around the Delta and made him a small local name. That was the peak of his fame while he was alive. A regional record that did okay. He had no idea what those songs would become. No idea that men not yet born, on another continent, would one day study every note like scripture. His career had barely begun, and it was about to end as suddenly and strangely as everything else in his life. Robert Johnson's death is one of the deepest mysteries in American music. We know roughly what happened. We will probably never know exactly. By August of 1938, Robert was playing country dances and juke joints near Greenwood, Mississippi. One regular spot was a little country store and dance hall out at a place called Three Forks. And this is where the accounts converge on something dark. The most repeated story is this. Robert had been paying attention to a married woman, the wife of the man who ran the place. One night, someone handed Robert an open bottle of whiskey, and the whiskey, the story goes, had been poisoned. There's a chilling detail here that many who were there confirmed. Another musician, the harmonica player Sonny Boy Williamson, was said to have knocked a bottle from Robert's hand earlier and warned him, never drink from a bottle that's already been opened. You don't know what's in it. Robert, by the telling, waved him off. Nobody tells me what to drink. He didn't die that night. That's the cruel part. He fell ill slowly. Over the next couple of days he suffered, and on the 16th of August, 1938, he died. He was 27 years old. One fellow musician, Johnny Shines, later passed on a horrifying second-hand account of Robert's final hours, that the poison had him crawling on the ground, howling like an animal. Whether that's literal truth, or the kind of story that grows in the retelling, no one can now say. And here's where the honest part matters, because not every historian is sure it was poison at all. His death certificate, which didn't even surface until decades later, listed no clear cause. Some researchers have suggested he may have died from complications of illness, not murder. The poisoning story is powerful, it's widely told, and it may well be true, but it is not certain. It sits, like almost everything about him, right on the border between fact and folklore. The music stopped that August. The mystery was just beginning, and even in death he refused to leave a clear trail. Today, there are 3 separate gravestones for Robert Johnson, scattered around Lafleur County, each at a different church. For years, no one could say which was real. The best guess, based on an elderly woman whose husband said he dug the grave, points to a spot beside a little country church near Greenwood. But even now, standing in Mississippi, you cannot say for certain where Robert Johnson lies, because nobody standing at his graveside had any idea. His real influence was still decades away. For nearly 20 years after he died, Robert Johnson was almost forgotten, a regional bluesman who'd left behind a handful of scratchy records. That was all. Then those records crossed the ocean, and a generation of young musicians in England heard something that changed their lives. Eric Clapton discovered Robert Johnson as a teenager, and it hit him like a physical force. He'd later call Robert the most important blues singer that ever lived. He also admitted the music overwhelmed him at first, that it was almost too raw and intense to bear. Decades into his own legendary career, Clapton recorded an entire album of nothing but Robert Johnson songs, and said it was a remarkable thing to have been driven his whole life by the work of one man. Then there's the story of Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. When his bandmate Brian Jones first played him a Robert Johnson record, Keith was so overwhelmed by the layered, intricate playing that he asked, in all seriousness, who the other guitarist was. He couldn't believe it was one man. It was. Keith would later compare the sophistication of Robert's playing to Bach. You think you're finally getting a grip on the blues, he said. And then you hear Robert Johnson. The Rolling Stones went on to record Robert's Love in Vain. Led Zeppelin built on his traveling riverside blues. Bob Dylan praised his lyrics as a kind of lightning he'd never seen matched, and the band Cream, with Clapton, turned Crossroad blues into the electric rock anthem Crossroads, which roared out of radios worldwide and carried Robert's name to millions who'd never heard the original. Sit with the strangeness of that. Almost nobody alive ever saw Robert Johnson play a single live show. He performed on street corners and in tiny Delta shacks for people who mostly forgot him. But millions upon millions of people have heard the musicians he shaped. His fingerprints are on songs you've hummed your whole life without ever knowing his name. And the more famous his students became, the more the legend of the teacher grew. For all that fame, there was still one haunting gap. Almost nobody knew what Robert Johnson looked like. For decades, there was not a single confirmed photograph of the most influential bluesman who ever lived. Think about how eerie that is. His music was everywhere, worshipped by rock gods, and his face was a total blank. A ghost with a guitar. Then, in the 1980s, that changed. 2 authenticated images finally surfaced, and they were startling. The first is a formal studio portrait taken in Memphis, and Robert doesn't look like a tormented soul who bargained with the devil. He looks sharp, confident, dressed in a crisp 3-piece suit, a fedora tilted just so, a lit cigarette held between his long fingers, cradling his guitar like he owns the whole world. He looks like a star who simply hadn't been discovered yet. The second is more intimate. A dime store self-portrait, the kind you'd get from a cheap photo booth. Here he's in shirt sleeves, guitar in hand, caught in a candid, almost shy moment. That was it. For years, just those 2 pictures, standing in for an entire life. A third image has been claimed since, but it's disputed, argued over by experts to this day. Imagine that. Guitarists who could recite his every lick, who'd bent their whole careers around him, and for decades not one of them could have picked Robert Johnson out of a crowd. When those faces finally emerged, fans studied them the way you'd study a relative you'd only ever heard stories about, trying to read a whole soul out of 2 frozen seconds. And the scarcity did something powerful. Because there were so few images, each one became enormous, iconic. Printed on album covers, posters, t-shirts, murals, the less there was to see, the more people stared. The fewer facts there were, the more room the myths had to multiply. And multiply they did. By now, Robert Johnson had become bigger than blues, bigger than music. He'd become a piece of American mythology, and the entertainment world couldn't get enough of the devil at the Crossroads. In 1986, Hollywood made a film called Crossroads, built around the deal with the devil legend, and it climaxed with a literal guitar duel against the devil's own player. Books piled up, some careful history, some pure fantasy. Documentaries came, including a Netflix film that put the Crossroads myth right in its title. Even brand new movies keep returning to that lonely intersection and the shadowy figure waiting there. The story simply refuses to die. And there's a whole tourist trail now. People drive from all over the world to Clarksdale, Mississippi, to stand at the crossroads of highways 61 and 49, under the sign with the two blue guitars, and take a photo at the spot where the deal supposedly happened. They go looking for the devil. And you can understand why. The legend gives us everything we crave. Genius that appears from nowhere. A dark, dangerous price. A brilliant young man doomed to an early grave. It's almost too perfect to give up. But here's what the serious historians keep gently insisting. Over the decades, blues researchers dug through census records, marriage licenses, death records, and the memories of everyone still alive who knew him. They found the mentor. They found the wife who died. They found the human being underneath the myth. And strip away the devil, and Robert Johnson gets more impressive, not less. Because someone still has to explain the music, and a poor, grieving young man who practiced obsessively until he was a genius is a harder, truer, more human miracle than any midnight bargain. So people come to Robert Johnson chasing a ghost story. They come for the devil and the crossroads and the poisoned whiskey. And then they actually listen to the records. And they stay for something the legend never mentions, the sheer, staggering skill of the man himself, which raises a quiet possibility. Maybe the greatest story here was never the supernatural one at all. Strip it all away, and look at what Robert Johnson actually left behind. Not a deal, not a curse, a body of work so far ahead of its time it still doesn't sound old. For years, his recordings gathered dust. Then, in 1961, a record label reissued them on an album called King of the Delta Blues Singers. That collection landed in exactly the right hands at the right moment, and it helped ignite the entire blues revival that shaped the 1960s. Decades later, in 1990, his complete recordings were released as a boxed set. Something no one could have predicted happened. A collection of scratchy pre-war Delta blues, recorded by a man dead for over 50 years, sold in the range of 1 million copies, and won a Grammy. Almost unheard of for music that old and that raw. The honors kept coming. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in its very first class, standing alongside Elvis and Chuck Berry as a founding force of the music. His recordings were entered into the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry, marked to be preserved forever as part of the nation's cultural memory. And having died at 27, he became, in a grim way, the first name in the so-called 27 Club, that haunting list of musicians lost at the same young age. But the deepest reason he still matters isn't the awards. It's what's actually happening in those 29 songs. One man, one guitar, sounding like a whole band. His thumb kept a steady, walking bass line rolling on the low strings, while his fingers picked out a melody up top and slid into those crying, vocal-like notes. And over all of it rode that high, ghostly falsetto voice. 3 or 4 things at once, from one person, live, in a hotel room, in a single take. Players still slow the recordings down today, note by note, trying to work out how his hands did it. Guitarists with decades of training, modern equipment, and every advantage Robert never had, sit with those crackling old tracks and come away shaking their heads. Many never quite crack it. The man who was laughed off a Delta stage plays things that stump professionals almost a century later. Robert Johnson didn't need 100 albums or a long life. 29 songs were enough to change music forever. So let's go back to where we started. To that empty crossroads at midnight, people still ask the question, did Robert Johnson really sell his soul to the devil for his gift? And they probably always will. But maybe that question misses the whole point, because the real miracle was never supernatural. The miracle is that a dirt-poor young man from the Mississippi Delta, a kid who was laughed off the stage, who left behind only 29 songs, barely 2 photographs, and a career that lasted a matter of months, could shape nearly everything that came after him: blues, rock and roll. Musicians on the other side of the world who'd never meet him and never forget him. He didn't need a deal with the devil. He had something rarer: obsession, a year in the dark, teaching his hands the impossible, and a gift for turning ordinary human pain into something that still stops you cold almost 90 years later. Perhaps that's the truth the legend keeps trying to cover up. That we invented a devil at the crossroads because the plain fact was harder to accept. That a man that young, with that little, could simply be that good. And if you ever find yourself out on a dark Delta highway, where two empty roads cross under the stars, you won't find the devil waiting there. You'll find something stranger, an ordinary place, made immortal by an ordinary man, who practiced until the whole world swore it had to be magic.